Hey everyone, and welcome back to the CyberPod with me, Tarek.
And me, Kash.
Now, today we're going to continue our Threats to Small Business series, and in this one we're going to talk about malware and a particular strain of malware that should resonate with a few people, ransomware. So we talked about phishing in previous episodes, and one of the main objectives for a threat actor conducting phishing is to try and get sensitive information from a user. Another is to get the user to click on a malicious link or an attachment. And then in doing so, the user may inadvertently execute a file on their device, which often contains some form of malicious software, or more commonly known as malware. Side note, one of the happiest moments a few weeks ago, I was in a pub quiz, and usually I'm useless. There's questions on music and the 60s and various points in history that I have no knowledge on. And then they had a cybersecurity question, and it was all about, well, what's the long name for malware? And everyone turned to me, and I was like, finally, my moment has come.
Oh, well, there you have it, guys. If you are in a pub quiz or on an episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you have...
I'm your man.
He's your man.
So what is malware, or malicious software, as known in its full term?
Well, it's in the name. It's software with bad intention. It wants to get on your system, and the idea behind it is it will extort some sort of information or carry out some action that will negatively impact your systems, be it your laptop, your company's servers, compromise the network. They either want to steal information, your users' data, your employee data, or they want to disrupt operations, so affect that availability. They want to take systems down, etc.
Yeah, nice. And why it's an issue? So, I mean, we live in a digital age, right? And we sometimes take for granted just how much information is stored on our devices. Things like contacts, photos, key notes, financial information, sensitive messages, a lot of content that we probably don't want exposed or leaked to threat actors. And malware is most commonly used to gain access and control over a device, and in doing so, gives that threat actor access to the content on said device. So, got any key examples of interest? I mean, you probably encounter it quite a bit.
Well, yeah, having worked as an analyst in this space, one that comes to mind immediately for two reasons. One, Friday afternoon, 4 p.m.
Golden hour.
Ruin the whole weekend. And number two, the scope. So usually you get something like this where a user's clicked on a link, their device may be compromised. You take an action like isolate that user's device, get it rebuilt, bam, bish bash bosh, everything's normal. On this occasion, when we started to scope the incident, we found out that the malware had moved from that user's device to several other devices in the company, including a bunch of servers. And that was because they were beaconing out or trying to connect to a command and control server for Cobalt Strike. And Cobalt Strike is a type of tool that allows the malware to scan your network and do that reconnaissance. It allows people, the malware, to move laterally. It's used to deploy other types of malware. So usually if you see Cobalt Strike, the next thing that's coming is ransomware. So luckily for us, the scoping found all the devices that were trying to beacon out to any Cobalt Strike command and control servers, and we were able to contain the incident, rebuild the devices and servers. There was obviously a bit of impact on the business because servers had this malware on it, but we saved the business from the ransomware that most likely would have followed, or the other malware that most likely would have followed.
Nice. I mean, that leads nicely into ransomware, I guess. So, what is ransomware? It's, a type of malware that is designed to permanently block access to that personal data, that device, until a ransom is paid, right? Clues in the name there. Like I said, cyber, not very creative, right? But ransomware groups tend to use this technique called cryptoviral extortion, right? So crypto encrypting the device to a point that, you want the keys to unlock that, you're going to have to pay us the ransom to do so. And there's these strong encryption algorithms that are going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for someone to be able to decrypt without the key. So ultimately, the only way you're going to get through and get back to that data is if you pay them the ransom. Now, the problem being that they will likely have put a time window on you, and if you don't adhere to that, they're going to delete the data, or they're going to make it permanently inaccessible to you if that ransom's not paid.
Yeah, and as you're saying, we touch on why this is an issue. I think you've covered that fully in your intro of what is ransomware. But once your data is encrypted, all the things you've said, you can now no longer access your data. Your business has come to a halt, essentially. Ransomware moves laterally. It will try to get from one device to the next device. It will do something called wake on LAN calls to wake up devices that were asleep, so it can move to them and encrypt those as well. And it will try and find your backup files if they're connected, and it will encrypt your backups. So again, why the offsite backups are so important.
Yeah.
And when that's happened, you either pay the ransom, or hopefully you have an offsite backup that will help you come back up and running. But usually both things take time, even if in some cases you can negotiate the ransom down. And there are companies out there that specialize in this. And it's important to mention that those people will verify the authenticity of the decryption key and make sure they actually have a key that can decrypt the data before they go and pay whatever. Let's say your business was hit and they demanded 250k. They may be able to talk it down to 100k, but they will get a sample to make sure, hey, this is the data, and you decrypted the data, and it shows that the key works.
It's this one really hits close to home because this is something that a family member did actually suffer from. But an example of this was the pathology service provider for the King's College Hospital Trust in the UK being hit with ransomware in June earlier this year. With I think over 800 surgeries ended up being cancelled. A load of different cancelled appointments. I mean, there's already a stretch on the NHS as it is.
800 was from one trust, but there were other trusts that were impacted as well.
Yeah, and ultimately the provider, Synovis in this case, refused to pay that ransom. The ransomware gang then turned around and dumped 400 gigabytes of that sensitive data on the dark web. And when you think about a hospital or trust, they have a lot of information on you. I mean, they need to know where you live, your contact information, next of kin, family, relations, etc. There's a lot of information and a lot of data that comes out in that. So yeah, it was a really big issue.
400 gig of data is a lot of data.
Yeah.
And that's your sensitive information out on a dark web forum for somebody else to buy and do with whatever they will.
So this begs the question, and I'm going to put you in the hot seat now because ultimately it is a big conundrum. You've had the dreaded email, you've had the dreaded communication to say we've infected your system with ransomware. It's you've got to pay us X amount, otherwise.
The conversation in the boardroom.
Yeah.
Do you pay or do you not pay?
Yeah. Deal or no deal.
Deal or no deal. I think ultimately, if you're talking about from a high level, if you pay them, what's to stop them getting back into your system again? What's to stop somebody, because you don't know how they got in, what's to stop somebody else from getting in and extorting you again? You're funding their operations. So you paid them, they will take that money to improve their ransomware's capability to move around, infect more people. You're helping them spread, grow, become a bigger threat. It's why ransomware's grown so much. It's because of how successful they've been and how much money they've collected over the years. On the flip side, from a business point of view, if you don't pay, you could be down for days, weeks, or even months before you're fully operational again. For small business, probably quicker, but for a larger organization, it could be months, because you could have servers in remote locations that you don't even know who owns them, and getting teams out there to rebuild that stuff takes time. And you're losing revenue during that whole time, which could be in the millions and more than what the ransomware was worth, or what you would have paid to get the decryption. And then on that, if you don't pay and you end up in a similar situation as the examples you just gave, your employee and customer data being dumped on the dark web and being pretty much publicly available.
Yeah.
So I think you have to follow whatever works best for you. And I gave an example of companies that come in and specialize in negotiating and helping you recover or get the decryption key at a cheaper rate. Maybe that's an option for you. But it depends on the sensitivity of the information, whether you can get back to business as usual if you don't pay. But I think the official guidance on this topic is don't pay. You don't want to fund their operations. You don't want them coming back in, and you just want better security practices. Obviously, when something like this happens and you think about how do I stop it happening again, that's when you invested in cybersecurity and you get offline backups and you test those backups to make sure they work, and you get the tools in place that would have potentially stopped this from becoming or a system from being infected with ransomware in the first place. But yeah, I don't know. I think it all depends on each company's scenario and specific circumstances. Can you afford not to pay?
Yeah, I think it's the ultimate question, right? Because, like you said, no one wants to have to do it. But if the choice is, okay, I can't keep going with my business, then it's obviously a really difficult predicament. And you understand why ransomware is so prevalent and why it is such a big deal, is because it puts people in an impossible position.
Yeah, and obviously we'd want to say don't pay, but we know if you're healthcare and in a situation where you can't cancel surgeries, where it's life or death,
it's very difficult.
It's very difficult to make that call that you're not going to pay, or if the business is something you've grown from the ground up and it's everything to you, and it's how you support your family or whatever. If you don't pay, you could potentially lose that. So it's you can't make those decisions until you're in those shoes, unfortunately. And I'd like to say, never pay, but it's not always the answer.
Yeah, I guess the recommendation is all around disaster recovery processes, right?
Yes, 100%. Make sure you have good backups, offsite backups, and make sure they're tested regularly. Yeah. They are useless to you if the incident happens, you go to recover and the backup doesn't work, or you've not tested it and it takes days and weeks for you to get things going and restored, where if you had been testing and people knew what they were doing and who was doing what at what time, you could be up and running in hours. So.
Yeah. I think from a backup and like recovery perspective, there's those two different types, right? And it's important to be aware of the distinction. You've got essentially two different ways to test it. The first one being like a tabletop exercise.
Yes,
could be as simple as this, right? A couple of us in a room just saying, "Okay, something's gone wrong. We've had a scenario. This has happened. What do we do?" And actually, it's not as useful for it to just be me and you in the room, because you want people throughout the business in there, because then you want people to know in that scenario, what do I do now? Not there's one person that handles this and that just happens to be when they're on annual leave.
And this is where, especially from an incident response point of view, when you do these tabletop exercises or simulated attack exercises, you go from a process to an operationalized process.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually having that communicated and understood across the business, because depending on who's available, depending on who gets the warning, who's working that day, that kind of thing, who's actually going to take this on board. So like you said, having that operationalized process is so key. I mean, the simple one to do is the tabletop exercise. get a nice scenario, a nice conversation going, but actually doing a proper simulation and going, okay, let's test the disaster recovery. Let's go, okay, the backups go here. Let's try and restore them somewhere and see what that looks like. How long does that actually take?
Yep.
Because for a huge, web application or a huge mobile application, it's probably not going to be a 10-minute job to get that back up and running.
Not clicking restore on your Windows laptop.
No, not a quick reboot the machine, 2 minutes, we're back up and running. There's going to be an associated time in there. And actually, when you think about things like your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective, like I said, I'm getting excited now about business continuity, disaster recovery. You're going to have to dial me back in.
We'll come back to it.
But
really,
yeah, you can't really have SLAs and you can't have like service level agreements and commitments to customers if you haven't tested these things. You can't say that, yeah, we're up 24/7 and, if we have an incident, we'll be back up and running within the next day. If you haven't tested that, you can actually fulfill that. And, that's what you have to validate with these tests.
Yeah. And I think coming back to malware in general, if I was to ask you, how would you prevent, or not prevent, maybe a difficult option, but reduce the risk of malware, what would your answer be?
Yeah, so we've touched on the first one before. Nice, simple, easy one to do. Software and computer up to date, right? The providers of software, of hardware services, do have patches and they do have vulnerability management programs where they identify issues with your machines, with your applications, with your services, and they're constantly looking for potential issues with it. And like you said, when we talked about in the previous episode, threat actors are also using that as useful information, because once a patch has come up, that is a potential vulnerability that they can exploit. It's a known vulnerability now, and if you haven't done that patch, your device is.
It's a matter of time from Patch Tuesday to when that is being exploited in the wild.
Exactly. Yeah. The second one is all about the access management side of things, right? So using a non-privileged or a non-administrator account for standard operations, right? I've done a number of roles where I need to do privileged operations throughout an organization, and I was always given a second account. So I have my standard user account and I have my privileged account. And if I need to make a privileged action, I need to go through additional steps to access that privileged account. That's where MFA is enforced. That's where there's conditional access policies that are looking at my location, what time I've signed in. It's building this risk profile of me.
Things like time-based access, or in AWS, I know there's a feature where you can request admin privileges for a certain amount of time or a specific task, and you have to give that justification, and then there's an approval process where it goes to your manager or somebody who knows what you're working on and understands the infrastructure to say, cool, he should be able to do that.
Exactly. So then if I'm using my standard level account for my normal processes and the worst does happen, I do click on a phishing email, I do something that I shouldn't, and the execution, the malware executes on my machine, it's only executing as a standard user. So it might try and do like the ransomware operations, but actually I don't have the permissions to do that. But if I'd signed in with my admin account, it would have the permissions to do that.
Or if users are not allowed to run executables, it will not run.
Yeah, and that's the key thing. It's thinking about scenarios, and that's why we talk about things like having like a partner that you work with, is they can advise you on these scenarios. And I think one of the things we really try and do at DGF9 is think about the worst case scenario and think about what can go wrong in this situation so that you're future proofing for security scenarios.
Yep.
And then that feeds then nicely into where you actually get programs and software and services from. And whilst one of the things you can do with device management is obviously not preventing users from running executables on their machines, you can also prevent them from downloading and installing programs from non-approved sources.
Application whitelists.
Yeah. And essentially then you have a scenario where you're defining what programs and software and services users can use, so that way they're not installing third-party services. They're not bringing some unknown application or a service onto their corporate machine.
Big, medium to large organizations do fairly well now. They use things like Microsoft Intune, to manage their application whitelist, so what users can install without admin privileges. So your default applications, they can just go in there and install and update regularly without needing an admin to log in and say, hey, I need to update
Exactly.
this piece of software.
Yeah, and I think that's always the best way to go about it is if it's on the approved list, cool, you can go run that, do your operations. If it's a new piece of software that's unknown, it's not been validated, it's going to need to go through that process. Then next, number 4 is all about, leading on nicely from the phishing talk that we've had, being cautious with email attachments and images, right? So ultimately, that malware has to get onto your machine in some way, right? So it wasn't on there before. So for it to get on there now, you either need to download something from the internet, or you need to click on something in an email, or you need to do an action that triggers the malware to be downloaded onto your machine and then start running. So being cautious about the different scenarios that potentially expose your device. So the email attachments and images.
With the emails, the stat you gave us earlier about 2022 report from Deloitte, that 91% of malware came from, or attacks started with a phishing email.
Yeah, because ultimately that's the trigger, right? It's, people are not necessarily going to be downloading and installing programs on their machine every day. There's going to be certain points in the year where they need a new piece of software and then they'll do it. What they are doing every day is reading and checking emails. So that's the best way to start targeting, to a way to get those payloads in there. Number 5, all about like antivirus and endpoint protection software. So really having things that are looking for malware signatures. They're looking for known malicious software. So it's particular executables on machines, but also it's particular actions that software's trying to take.
And I think that's why you've mentioned endpoint protection, right? So antivirus typically is signature based, it's known things, whereas endpoint protection will stop things based on the actions that are being taken rather than this is just
I know that's
is malicious, so I'll block it, because they will then pick up on things that were unknown, whereas antivirus typically, at least older versions, will not pick up on these things.
So into number 6 then, all about firewalls. And I think this is one of the things I pick up all the time in cloud computing, especially in this remote working environment that we have now, is that firewall rules are all over the place because some people use VPNs, some people say that VPNs aren't stable, their VPN that they have isn't stable enough. They'll essentially open up the ports and the connections to their servers to the wider internet because I need to access it in the office, but I also need to access it at home. So before, if you're in the office 5 days a week, you might have just the office IP address as the approved way of connecting into that server. But actually now you need someone at home, somebody in a different country. So before, if you saw somebody connecting from a different country, that would be suspicious. Now you might have a distributed workforce, and so that's no longer that suspicious. So it's those scenarios where your firewall isn't configured in the most secure way. And so what you got then thinking about in that scenario is, well, with the firewall, you can control the traffic coming in and the traffic going out. So what that malicious software is going to try and do is take the files and do something with it. And most of the time, it's going to try and send data somewhere else. And so having a block on or a restriction on where your application services can send information to helps to prevent it from going to these dodgy.
And usually even before that exfiltration point that you just mentioned, it tries to connect to its command and control center to tell it what to do next, especially with automated things, which is most of the attacks nowadays.
Yeah.
But it will stop it at an infancy rather than where the data is actually being exfiltrated.
Yeah, nice. Next, it's all about suspicious sites. So, I mean, this is pretty much everywhere, but you can have it within your emails, and that's where you can potentially identify phishing emails is through the suspicious sites. But also when it comes to things like where you're downloading content from, where you're installing applications from, where you're browsing the internet and looking at things. I think this touches on a nice area of threat intelligence. And actually, threat intelligence tooling is really useful in this space to provide you with constant information around suspicious IP addresses, suspicious domains, things that other users in the community have noted, reported, etc. So it's designed, okay, somebody else has experienced this, so we're going to try and warn you so that you don't also experience this. So it's that community, right?
For the bigger organizations, having a web security gateway that will scan the content, because an hour ago this website may have not been malicious, but now it is. So a web security gateway can help with that.
Yeah, awesome. So then into number 8, it's all about the incident response plan, right? And so like we keep banging on about, you can't necessarily prevent every issue from happening. In the case of malware, you can massively reduce the impact that it might have with the previous 7 steps, but there is a scenario that it could still come onto your machine. So in the scenario that it has executed, it has caused some impact to your systems, your services, your devices.
What do you do?
What are we doing? Like, what do we do? Does the whole company, the whole organization just stop now? Do we just close down, or do we have a way that we actually handle this? I think that's where, when we talk about things like tabletop exercises and simulations, it's really breeding into the team that we have to find a way to handle this, and we have to do something.
Plan, and you bring that plan to life.
Okay, like it's the worst case scenario, but it's a scenario. So what do we do? And then finally, backing up your data, testing those backups regularly, making sure that it is actually usable, right? Because there's no good having backups in the same location, or backups that you can't actually restore from, or the whole backup and restore process takes a week, but you've promised your customers that you're going to be back online in 3 hours. That's just not going to work. So I think it's making sure that these processes are all joined up, and actually there's a whole operational side of your cybersecurity program. You know how everything works. You know what you're doing to try and prevent the issue from happening, but then what you're doing to actually detect issues when they do happen and respond to them, so that you can recover in the best way. But I mean, they're the main areas to prevent and reduce the risk of malware. Like we said, it's not always.
I think that's the perfect place for us to say we'll stop right there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us on this episode of the CyberPod. Like I said, if this content is useful for you,
please share.
Yeah, please do share with family, friends, those with small to medium businesses. I think we're definitely trying to grow this and build our reach.
Yeah, and let us have your feedback and questions.
Yeah, we'll try and tailor some future episodes to actually answer some of those questions as well.
Thank you for your time. I've been Kash.
And I've been Tarek. We'll see you on the next one.